a lot lately.
One of my bloggers uses it a ton.
It's like such a remnant. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Higher Ed Live. I'm your host, Franz Blocky from mStoner, guest hosting this week. I have an awesome guest, Maayan Plout, who's going to introduce herself in just a minute. But before we get started, I did want to give a shout out to Higher Ed Live's sponsors. So, sponsor number one is Omni Update. Omni Update is leading web content management system provider for higher education. Company focuses on providing an exceptional customer experience to its 45,000 plus OU campus CMS users around the globe. OU campus is secure and scalable with great tools and features plus deployment flexibility. In fact, it was voted as a 2012 and 2013 top product by University Business Readers. So if you need a CMS, check them out at www.omniupdate.com, and we'll be tweeting out a link to them momentarily. Also a sponsor of Higher Ed Live is FormStack. FormStack is a robust online form building solution with an intuitive drag and drop interface. The platform makes it easy for marketers to create branded, mobile-ready web platforms without writing code. Build donation forms, contact forms, event registration forms, and more with the web's only 508 compliant form builder. Publish your forms and use FormStack's social media plugins to maximize your traffic. With in-app analytics and partnerships with popular marketing tools, you can get even more out of your captured data. Visit www.formstack.com to learn more about the ways FormStack can double your response rates, and a tweet to that is going out momentarily as well. Higher Ed Live is also sponsored by mStoner. mStoner, where I work, is a marketing communications firm that works with educational institutions around the globe on branding, strategy, web design, and more. And if you are looking for an innovative solution to one of your digital marketing needs, we're sending out a tweet to click right now. All right, so sponsors have been introduced and thanked. My guest is eagerly awaiting introducing herself, so I will get right to that. Maayan, would you like to talk a little bit about who you are, where you work, and what you do?
Yes, indeed. My name is Maayan Plout. I am the manager of social strategy and projects at Oberlin College. That means that it's actually not very different from what my job used to be, which is making Oberlin look cool on the internet, but now it's got a greater focus on making sure the content that we produce is the best that it can be, so that when we distribute it on places like social media, it's going to be even greater and reach more people because it's better for them in the first place. I have been playing a lot with content, like legacy content, this year, and I've learned a ton in the process of kind of digging in and doing the auditing and strategy stuff related to that. So I'm really excited to talk about this sort of planning as we start to think about new projects this year, too.
Absolutely. And so Maayan is my guest on this discussion of content strategy and kind of content first, because she's one of the most prolific content producers that I know in higher education. And that includes doing some awesome stuff with in official capacity with Oberlin, but also just being an avid user of social media personally and maintaining a lot of really good personal content as well. So this topic today is a spinoff of a blog post that I posted on the mStoner blog earlier last week about content first strategy. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that when we sit around and discuss doing a new web relaunch project, we so frequently describe it as a web redesign, which it is, of course. But why is it that we call it a redesign as opposed to a rewrite? Because really, when the rubber hits the road, as it does inevitably at some point during one of these web projects, you need to produce new content. Or, at a very minimum, you need to take a look at the content you already have out there and revise it for the new site. Or I suppose if you're extremely lazy, you just at least need to copy and paste it over to the new fancy design. But that's not a best practice that we're encouraging. So anyway, I had started to think about this, and I've also seen some really interesting discussions and been to a couple presentations in the last year or so about agnostic content. So essentially take the idea that we have with responsive design in the sense that we are trying to create designs that are platform agnostic and browser device agnostic and screen size agnostic, and think about that from the standpoint of content as well. So often I think we get so excited about doing a new design and we get so excited about restructuring our pages that it's almost, by the time we think about how we're actually going to fit the content that we need to produce into it, it's almost as if we've built ourselves into a bit of a constrained sandbox. I won't say that there isn't room to work with, but we've already kind of made some decisions which are going to dictate what the content on our site is going to look like. And so what I want to think about today is flipping that around a little bit and what would it look like if we took a content-first approach. So basically, the content that we need to produce is what is dictating the design. And ultimately, if you look at some of the more popular, really well-shared and highly trafficked pages for content, I'll use Medium as an example, they have a very, very minimal style, right? It's all about focusing on the content. It's almost getting back to kind of just the basics where we were before we had CSS and heavy designs and things like that. Now, I'm not saying that we should just eschew all design for the rest of time, and I think design
nothing pretty ever again.
Right. It's not that we don't want anything pretty ever again, and it's not that design isn't important. It's just that I feel like design has had plenty of days in the sun and will continue to do so, but content really needs a little bit of love. So anyway, just to lay the groundwork for conversation and kind of where I'm at in my head these days, that's what's going on. So, Maayan, any thoughts initially about that? Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective because I'm the one dealing with a lot of the content that could be going on to new websites. So our Oberlin homepage got redesigned a year and a half ago. And in redesigning it, we knew that there were a bunch of like content pieces, and it was actually something that I hadn't really figured out how to articulate until I heard Doug Gopinski talk about prototyping, and that even when prototyping design, you have to have what he's calling the minimum viable content out there so people at least know what kinds of like things are going to have to be filled and maintained as the design moves forward in the prototype and then in the iterations of it being actually out there. And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, that actually makes a ton of sense in terms of how we are thinking about our homepage in particular. So just the homepage got redesigned. All the content underneath it still looks the same and is in varying states of useful or needing to be redesigned as well. But the top level homepage has 3 distinct parts, and out of those 3 distinct parts, one of them is static all the time, one of them changes every couple days, and one of them changes every couple months. And we had to have a plan in place for those individual parts of the site when deciding we were going to do a redesign. What we were doing was trying to bring to the surface actually older content that was still really useful. So the design of it might not be super pretty content-wise, but the story that we're trying to tell is still very relevant. And it was partially a necessity of we don't have a ton of people, and the stuff that we've made in the past is still going to continue being useful for us moving forward. But it kind of placed a different emphasis on how we thought about it every single day. So while it resurfaces a lot of old stuff, it's also a good way to showcase new stuff that's still being produced in those same manners. So that our top part of the page is a photograph that changes every couple days. That is a combination of stuff that's happening in the moment, but also stuff that's happened kind of around campus in the last 5 to 150 years, depending on what pictures we have.
Right.
And then the next thing below that is kind of a rotating mosaic of first-person stories and blog posts, and then photographs and videos that our office produces that are kind of being shared. That's our social section almost, because it's telling the story without us saying, here is the story. It's kind of presenting people with information, allowing them to kind of work along from that point. But it's been very interesting to think about that, because before our homepage was it was still, there was an emphasis on content, there were a lot of different sections that didn't seem to necessarily work together. And it's been a really nice shift for us to start thinking about each of those different places where we know we have to fill with the same kind of thing every day, but it also needs to be different. And it's not an everyday thing, but a constantly iterative process. The primary source section mosaic thing that I described, it's gone through 2 or 3 design iterations even since we started with this new design, and it's been to showcase the content better.
So let me dig into that a little bit, because it sounds like you've given a lot of thought in on multiple iterations as to how well content is being portrayed, and even how certain content could be added if the design were updated. So what does that look like in the back room at Oberlin? Like, who's talking about this, and what's the process you're using to get to those decisions that you've made? I mean, you know, what kind of questions are you asking yourselves, and what kind of things are you debating as you're trying to create a homepage that is ever better at accommodating the content that you're producing, and also please talk a little bit too about how it is that you identify old content to repurpose, and how that impacts the decision.
I'm going to tackle that first question first, because the last question you said first, because it actually, I think, answers the other ones really well. Okay. So really what it comes down to is not technology, but people. And the people in our office understand, like, either having the time or the experience or the knowledge about what's going on in our archives or the things that are being produced, to make sure that we're covering all of our bases with the amount of work we're putting into something. So that main picture that changes every couple days, that is decided on by a committee of people that actually sit down and talk about it every couple weeks, to make sure that we aren't putting all of our sports things out there all at the same time, or all of our campus life pictures out there all at the same time. So we each use each other's checks and knowledges and experiences to make it work better moving forward. And that group went from being like 1 or 2 people to being about 8 right now, and it's represented by all of our different teams within the office, so we're all bringing in our own expertises and knowledge of what we even have. So it's a decision-making process where we basically talk through what it is that we want to represent this week. And I personally think it works really well, because at this point, having representation from print and media and our conservatory communications office and social media and design all at the same time means that we end up with a piece of content that can go in multiple places, that can translate to multiple audiences, and already has like a high quality visual to go along with it to simply draw somebody in. So we've got different like perspectives and experiences that actually bring everyone together. Same thing goes for that content mosaic, except it's not as big a team. It's like 4 people thinking about that. And a lot of it really just does come down to the fact that multiple people in those groups have worked at Oberlin for long enough that we've seen a lot of content get produced and not necessarily get distributed well. So if we are not necessarily producing tons more stuff because we just don't have the capability or the budget or the people, using what we already know means that we can better implement it with the designs and the thinking that we have moving forward. I think answer 2 of your questions. I don't remember what the third one was. Oh, how we start preparing for it. So part of it is also really knowing who we are, and I think every school kind of has this challenge of who are you and what are you trying to tell people about yourself. I feel like Oberlin's got it kind of easy because we've known who we are for a while now. Like historically, we have a number of things that support what we do and what decisions we'll probably make moving forward. And the stories that we tell support those in multiple ways. So deciding like what our pictures are going to be, or what our stories are going to be, or what kind of stories we're going to tell has more to do with the fact that we've been relatively consistent in who we are for 175 years. So it's not difficult for us to shift. But I think for many other schools, especially the ones that haven't been around for 150 years or don't necessarily have a defining culture or spot in like more national history, it's a little bit harder to figure that out. But a lot of what we have learned is listening to the people that are a part of the community makes it a lot easier to know what sorts of things are actually going to resonate and represent well.
That's awesome. So you have, I mean, what I would describe as a mature content production pipeline.
Sure. I would say maturing maybe rather than mature.
Maturing, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, relative to where a lot of people who might be watching are.
Yes.
Or they might be just starting out. You've made the connections on campus. You've identified kind of who the people who are producing the content are. You get together every 2 weeks, which is pretty good, like pretty frequent. and decide, you know, you want to make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes. You want to make sure that you're not all talking about the same thing at once. That's great. That's all really great. And I guess, so talk a little bit about, you know, for someone who's starting out right now on campus and looking to build that type of culture, what do you think some of the first things that they're going to want to do are? And talk a little bit too about, and this is again a combined question, but talk a little bit too about what you use to track things. So you meet every 2 weeks, but I'm guessing there's some documents that are used and a little bit of procedures. So talk a little bit about that too.
Okay, I will, but I'm also going to turn that back on you because I don't know that our technology is supporting what we're doing as well as it could, but we also don't necessarily know what's out there. I'm in the communications office. I probably forgot to mention that earlier. So I sit in the kind of central communications hub, and we work with a ton of other people on campus. Within our communications office, we have a number of different teams that work on specific projects or specific initiatives more regularly than others. But we all kind of work together, and that's very much a function of our office's culture and the leadership in our office. The interesting thing about my role is that in doing the social media management part of things, I have to build relationships with people all over campus, and while I am not managing their social media properties, I am advising them on how they can do it better based on what I've learned from doing it for the whole school. So for me, a lot of it comes down to how I started kind of digging really deep into the content element of my job was looking at what's already out there and starting to try and categorize it based on what I know we're trying to do. So part of that would be asking, I guess tip one, ask questions of the people that you're working with and either directly in your office or more externally around campus. What story are you trying to convey? And then the secondary question of what audiences are you trying to reach as well. And knowing those two things is kind of hard. You actually, in asking those questions, you have to kind of go back and think about it sometimes, or go back and start listening or asking those questions of other people as well. I don't have the answer to most of the things that I'm talking about now, except for the fact that I've been involved in way more conversations about it in the last year, which has been super cool. So for me, it started by kind of taking stock of the things that we were already producing regularly. And the two things I've kind of done the deep dive into this past year has actually been our YouTube channel and our Oberlin blogs, which is actually a property that I manage and am the kind of encourager of content for that when it comes to our student content producers. It's been really interesting, and it takes a lot of time, but you also end up learning a ton about what was important enough at the time that we thought it was a good idea to make something about it. And I learned it, like, I'm an Oberlin graduate. I've been working here for 4 years. I care a lot about this place, but even going through the archives of what we have, I started learning many, many other things and seeing many, many other perspectives than just my own, and that was very valuable in kind of defining what the Oberlin story really looks like. So I guess tip 2 would be, if you don't have answers to those 2 questions I mentioned earlier, clearly start to try and dig down into them. And it's not that the answers won't change, but it's good to start having a baseline of things to talk about, both with your internal office and then around campus as well. So for the folks on campus that I work with regularly, it's summer. We're getting new people who are starting, July 1st in their new roles, and they're diving in head first without really knowing what they're getting into. A lot of it just has to do with kind of aligning yourself and knowing what's there already, and then knowing what the rest of the world is doing around you. I guess a good example of this, our Career Center got 2 new really awesome people who are going to be in charge of student engagement this coming year. How do you start learning everything about student engagement at Oberlin? You could go out and talk to students, but it's really hard to do that during the summer. So the research that you do between July 1st and orientation next week, 2 weeks from now, is looking at the resources that already exist, so that when you start talking to people about it, it's going to be easier for you to kind of see if that stuff that you've already created is going to be used to moving forward, or how it needs to be reframed for the next steps. I think I went a little bit off.
No, that's great. No, I'm letting you go because it's all really, really good. And in fact, so there's 2 things that I'll pull out of that I want to comment on. One is that you know, the perspective you can gain from looking at old content
Mm-hmm.
is kind of almost like a fresh set of eyes. And I think that
Yeah.
I think it's very easy, especially when you are responsible for maintaining current, fresh content, for that to be the overwhelming focus of what you do. But it's
Absolutely.
so worthwhile to remember that there have been people who have come before. There have been stories that have been told before. There
Yeah.
has, you have an institutional legacy. You have lots and lots and lots of content that's happened in the past, and that some of it is good and should be repurposed for the present. It's good enough to bring it up again. Case in point, Higher Ed Live. We're on Higher Ed Live. We're creating fresh, current
Yeah.
content. People are watching it live right now.
Mm-hmm.
We have hundreds of episodes. Some of it is kind of moment in time. It's kind of relevant only to that particular era or time. A
Yeah.
lot of it's evergreen, and a lot of it actually gives you an interesting perspective of how a particular topic or discussion has evolved over time as well.
Oh yeah.
So, and how things have changed. So I think that's great advice, that being able to repurpose your old content is really important. And the other piece that I think really gets to where I'm at with how to develop a content-first strategy when you're doing a redesign is what you mentioned the question set was that you asked people. So
Mm-hmm.
you identified at least 2, if not 3 of the 4 that I would ask someone before I started this process, and that is essentially, who's your audience, right? And for higher education, it's typically prospective students if you're enrollment, current students if you're student affairs, but there are other audiences in there. So it's important to figure out who your audience is, what do they need to do with your site, what information is most important to them, what features, not design, but what features make sense as far as from a content standpoint. So, do we want blog posts? Do we want like little snippets of testimonials from people? Do we want long form narrative? Do we want video with captions? Do we want photo galleries? So there's lots of different forms that content takes, and it's like figuring out like what do we think that the best form of content is to actually convey this message, and that's the other thing. So what is the primary message that we're trying to send with this site? And it might not be something that we're explicitly sending, right? It's not in 50-point font at the top of the screen, here's the message. It's more implicit. It's like using a combination of all of these types of content. What is the message we want to collectively convey to people? And then another question that I would ask is, what impression do you want to leave on people? Or a different way of looking at that is, what quote do you want someone to have said about your site once it's done, right? Like imagine that you're trying to solicit feedback and you want people to be glowingly reviewing whatever you've done. What is it that they're going to say about the site? Are they going to say, I just couldn't believe how easy it was to find the information that I was looking for? Well, if that's the reaction that you want, then that's what, that's one of your goals. And so what we've been doing on our side, Stoner, on some of the projects is to get away from, or at least begin with content-only outlines as opposed to wireframes and eventual designs. We get to wireframing, we get to designs eventually, but it's been an interesting, it's been some interesting work for us because our designers' feedback, our design team's feedback on getting what's essentially, a bulleted list saying, here's the primary messages, here's primary actions, transactions we want people to take, here's the primary informational needs they have, here's like the emotional or, here's the visceral reaction we want people to have. Kind of outlining it that way and saying, here's the features, the different types of content that we want. Period. Go be brilliant, go be creative, come up with something that fits this. The reaction from the creative team has been good, been positive to say like, we like this. This is like this is the biggest sandbox you can give us, essentially. Because you're not, when you wireframe, you're already starting to make some assumptions about structure. And I mean, every time we do a wireframe, and I'm not knocking wireframes because they're extremely valuable. as a second step, right? But it's interesting to kind of have this pre-step involved because it helps those wireframes to be that much more accurate, I think, in the long run. So anyway, so like that's a content first approach to my mind
But it's also really challenging to think that way.
It is very challenging to think that way, and sometimes it's a little scary because you don't have an answer to the question, right? It actually helps at the beginning when you start to ask these questions because you identify pages that maybe should not exist, right? Like, why are we actually going to redo? Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
You know, do we have a clear message that we're sending to an identified audience that, you know, has a desired result, whether that is a transaction is going to be completed or they are going to be imparted with knowledge that we want them to have. And are they going to, you know, are they having a positive reaction? Is this actually accomplishing that you know, that emotional connection with them? So yeah, it can help to have the conversation early on. I'm sorry, I want your thoughts on that too.
No, it's okay. The first thing you started talking about actually really reminded me of so again, like I'm coming at this from the social media perspective because that's kind of my wheelhouse most of the time. Two things about the legacy content that like it's incredibly helpful to kind of look back to know where you were so you know where you're going. But there is a great emphasis on that right now with social media, that we are using social media to look back a lot more. It's Throwback Thursday and Way Back Wednesday, but for our content. And that's, I don't know, I think we have started getting very distracted by like social media always needs to be fresh and new, and we're getting distracted by make fresh and new all the time without realizing that before we were clouded by everyone's message all the time doing all things, there's a good chance that we knew who we were before that. And the looking back process is actually very valuable in order to like know what kinds of mistakes were made before so you can avoid making them again in the future. I don't know, I guess I'm like approaching this from like almost, in order to be wise about the choices that you're going to make, you need to know what's out there. And that's also hard because looking back in that sort of reflective manner, like I look back at my own writing from college and don't recognize that I wrote it, but I recognize that I guess there's value in it because one of my most trafficked blog posts this year is something I wrote 4 years ago. So it's a hard thing to balance because you have to kind of see the things you don't necessarily want to see about yourself, but truth be told, like if you're seeing that about yourself when you reflect on it, your audience is seeing that without you saying, hey, can you reflect upon this?
I think that's a really good example, though, to say that a blog post you wrote 4 years ago still is very popular, and we have that too. You know, some of the blog posts that have been on the M-Stoner blog for a while are evergreen. Like they're just they're always popular. And I think that if you think about how we all consume content online, how often do you actually look at when something was published? I mean, you may see, you know, oh, this is new, this is up now. But the way that we kind of scan, and I think especially at least with mobile, and this is my own personal anecdote, but like I'm consuming information. I'm like, oh, this is an interesting article. I read it, and sometimes it's not until I'm finished and I look at who the author was and when it was published that I realize I'm reading an article that was written 6 years ago.
How did you find that article, though? I'm more curious because that's hard. That's really smart if you manage to find something from 6 years ago, or that it was presented to you now and you still find it relevant. Because I would say that a lot of things aren't being created with that in mind.
Yeah. It's usually search, and I am not by no means a search expert. The more so relevancy and FB are the two key components for Google, right? So that it's got that's looking out there, trying to figure out on a particular subject what is the most relevant, authoritative content, and not necessarily the most current, although current obviously is part of that algorithm. So I think it's really interesting. And this is in my own research. This is me looking into, you know, what are other people saying about content strategy? What are other people saying about content first approaches? You know, so this topic that we're talking about right now, this is an example of that. And so it's fascinating. And information architecture is another one. Usability, user experience. You know, I'll use information architecture used to be the buzzword like 10 years ago, right? And it actually fell out of favor as user experience became the broader term used to describe kind of the family of skill sets and family of work that information architecture was a part of, right? But in the beginning, IA was like its own thing and really was buzzword. Well, in doing research about like how it's evolved, the history of information architecture, I found some really, really relevant, extremely important articles that were written that really haven't had any new, any thinking in the last 6 or 7 years that has superseded their authority or their relevance to that topic. And so I just think it's really interesting when we think about content first, that content far, far outlives design when it comes to quality. You might have the best design today, and it might be the hottest thing going for like 2 or 3 years. That article that's 10 years old that is still getting more hits than the ones you're writing today on your blog is proof, I think, that good content is where we should start. That's ultimately what's going to leave the biggest footprint. You may be through 3 or 4 redesigns by the time you get 10 years down the road, and that's fine. And again, I don't want to like give people the impression that I'm diminishing the importance of design. I think it's extremely important to have.
Well, I think it's also a chicken and egg situation when it comes to content, because you have to have created something to know whether or not it's going to work. And that's why I think the auditing process is incredibly important to figuring out like content strategy moving forward, is that the only reason why I can now look back and say that blog post from 4 years ago is very valuable is that we were actively listening, heard a need to talk about something in particular, and it's a thing that comes up every single year. And it's only in listening and seeing a lack in that content to know that we actually need it. The post I'm talking about is about student jobs at Oberlin. Every single year, incoming students want to know what kinds of jobs they're going to get as a student. So hearing that made me write essentially a blog post article that said, here are some jobs that I had as a student. Here are some places you can look for jobs as a student. And that post every single year resurfaces. Same thing with all that same, like, to me, that means not just that the blog post is really valuable, but whatever part of our site that talks about student employment needs to have more of the, this is how you get a job as a student. But that's like 3 steps down the line.
I mean, it's an actionable thing. If something you wrote 4 years ago is still the most important piece of content for this particular audience and this particular need, there's a need for it. Like, I mean, like, people are going to continue coming back again and again and again, and so that's where analytics does help to figure out, your content mix and your content strategy. What's resonating with people? We've done like 15 posts on this one topic, and combined those don't add up to like what we're getting off of this other, this other post. Why is that? Well, this is what people are actually interested in. So
I think part of it though is also having the human touch of it, because the reason why we know that post will resurface every year is that every year the question is asked, and every year myself or someone else knows that this post is out there and that we should be presenting it to our students at the time. So it's partially analytics telling us, yes, this is important, but it's also listening to our audience saying, we need this, and knowing how to react. And that's where I think like the relationship between like social media and content strategy and web design is actually really important, and why I'm really happy that I'm on that like small committee where we decide on what kinds of stories we're telling on our homepage, because our audiences are talking about us not necessarily to our faces. And while the analytics will tell us a lot about what somebody might care about, a lot of our background research for what kinds of stories we're telling is getting reinforced by social media, not directed at us every single day. Yeah.
So you're actually actively monitoring topically what is resonating with people on social media.
Yes.
And using that for feature content.
Yes.
And vice versa.
Absolutely. Yes. It's a hardship though, because you have to know what to listen for, and I think for someone starting out for the first time, you might not know what to listen for, which is why having that initial conversation within your office around your campus will start to pull out some of those nuggets that you might know will be out there. I guess it's the consistency, and again, in knowing who you are, it's going to be easier to listen, because social media makes it easy to listen, but it's also hard to listen because there's so many people talking about so many things. Where do you even listen in the first place?
I know. A whole other show's worth of discussions on that one.
Oh, yeah. We don't need to go there. But one of the questions you asked earlier about how you start organizing all of this, part of that is very valuable in order to like get new people up to speed, and also to kind of reflect upon what you've done before. But you have to start doing something, and for us, like the answer is a series of like emails and a task management system and an Excel spreadsheet. But I don't know what each individual person's process is as well, and I'm sure we all have different things. For me, the social media distribution part of it is through Google Calendar, because it was the easiest way that I could think of to schedule something and then trigger it at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Like, are there ways that you've seen or that you've experienced that you have find to be effective? I don't know. Ours tend to be we recognize a need in ourselves and use the products that we already know, and it's usually a combination of piecing things together, and there hasn't been anything perfect yet.
Right. Well, I mean, one approach that we've taken is to kind of extend the editorial calendar idea as wide as you can cast it, essentially. So you know, whether your focus is social media or the alumni magazine or enrollment materials or website feature space, essentially, and I've talked about this kind of from the engagement management standpoint, where all of this is messaging that people are going to consume from you, and they're not necessarily going to differentiate between one channel and another. And so, if you've got messages at cross purposes, or the same message being, echoed across 6 different channels all at the same time, so it's like it's just overwhelming. That's not good. So the solution is create an editorial calendar that takes into account all of those different channels and organize it topically. So figure out what your primary, from a recruitment standpoint, what are your primary selling points? What are your primary differentiators? Figure out what, a few themes that you can tie everything into. So maybe it's, everyone's academic excellence, but maybe it's like service, just to take an example. Okay, so service is one of the thematic topics that we tie content to. Okay, great. We're planning out the next 2 to 3 months worth of content across all these different channels, and we've given ourselves a quota, right? We give ourselves a quota. We have to have at least this many messages go out that have to do with service. How are we going to divvy this up across all the different channels so that we have a balanced approach? So we're touching a number of different channels over the course of time. We're not like bunching everything up in the, over a 3-day period. So that kind of thinking, and managing it. I'm a huge fan of Google Docs because I feel it makes what used to be almost an impossible logistics challenge much easier. So have a centralized Google spreadsheet that has all of this stuff in columns, the channel, the theme that we're tying to, the person who's responsible for it, the date that we're going to publish it on, all of that in one place. And then, to your point about getting together with identify the group of people who need to do this, get together face-to-face regularly, and then in the interim use a document like that to maintain everybody's sanity, basically. So if you've got a great idea for content that needs to go up, and I want to tell this story about X, Y, or Z, you're checking yourself before you're just like putting it out there. There's a middle step. It's like, check this schedule, and you know what? This is an awesome story. We are already telling 3 stories about the environment this week, which is too many. A 4th is just going to break the bank. Why don't we just, and let's embargo this for 1 or 2 weeks, because then it'll be fresh again. So it's, these are the types of conversations you're having when you do something like this, and it just having it all laid out can really help, and identify kind of where you can repurpose stories. Because another thing that has driven me crazy at different times is the idea that stories are owned by some particular area of the campus. And this goes for photography too. It's like, well, we're going to publish this in the alumni magazine.
But so no one can see it beyond the alumni magazine.
Are for the alumni magazine. You guys can use it once the alumni magazine has mailed, right? Give it a week so that we know that everyone's gotten it, and then you can put it on the web. And it's like, no. Wrong.
So
this is a great story. Let's tell it as many places as we can. So that's the type of stuff that a combined content calendar, content editorial calendar, can really help with. So
We actually do utilize one of those here too, and that meeting is more of a general FYI meeting for a ton of people. We don't necessarily make a ton of decisions within it, but we do kind of get all on the same page, which is awesome. When you said we have too many stories about the environment this week, we should embargo it, I'm so glad that you said that, because if the response to that is no, but we have to do it now because it's relevant now, the editorial calendar should start to fix that. That you should have at least enough foresight to know that talking about the environment this week is going to be very important. And if a story is not going to work 2 weeks from now, why did you wait it?
exactly. Yep.
It is a minor pet peeve of mine, because
right. But why is it so important? Is it so important because so and so said it's so important? Is it because, I mean, you know, like is it important because it's Earth Day? You know, it's important because there was a major, you know, breaking news article about an oil spill in the middle of the ocean, and we have a professor who's able to speak intelligently about that exact topic and potentially even get some press, but we have, you know, a 48-hour window to do it? Or is it just important because you decided it was important? You know, so yeah, like having that conversation is really important.
So, like, the editorial calendar thing has actually helped us a ton to kind of line some of that up already, because our editorial calendar is not just bound to what's in our heads, it's bound to the campus calendar and our community's calendar, and our community's calendar is literally the whole world because our audience is all over the place. Mm-hmm. So, an environmental article the week of Earth Day is brilliant because it's already on the minds of our audiences, and it's kind of inserting ourselves into the conversation. That goes into an entirely other thing that we could talk about forever. But
yeah, everything's connected, and there's always things to talk about, which is great. So we're getting towards the end of our time, but I do, you know,
already?
I guess, isn't it amazing how fast I mean, Maayan and I will probably just hang out and talk for the next couple hours off the air.
Yes,
because it's always entertaining to catch up with her. But I think it may be more a mentality than an actual structured practice at first, to just check ourselves and say, why are we designing this? You know, it's almost the same conversation. Why is this important to publish right now? Why are we designing this right now? Are we designing this because some new HTML5 like way of visually wowing people has been developed, and we're like going to do that and then figure out what to put there later? Or are we saying, you know what, we have this cool piece of content that parallax design would be perfect for? And it's like, switch it around a little bit and start to think about, do you have content that would even go in something like that? But like, even more importantly, what content do we have? What are we able to produce, and what design is a right fit for us? Because too often I think we get over ambitious a little bit. We get excited about the possibility of what a new design can do, and the possibility of what new functions in a new design can do. But we don't think about, you know, what the ramifications are for content production. And so one thing that we always do, and you know, I mean, in this is in the name of, or this is our subhead essentially below mStoner, is to say smart, sustainable solutions. Well, the thing I always focus on is sustainable, right? It doesn't help if you get a brand new website that you can't sustain, that's empty after 2 months because you've run out of people who can actually supply content. So everyone gets really excited about redesigns, and justifiably so. But you know, when the dust settles and the balloons are deflating and the cake's all gone after the big web redesign launch, someone's got to maintain the content. You know, and so if you thought about the content first, then you're much more likely to be successful there. So, parting thoughts, Maayan.
It's actually my parting thought from Confab last year, which just got reinforced a lot during this whole conversation, which is that content strategy is more of a people thing than it is an actual content thing. And the solutions to like figuring out how your stuff really works comes down to the interactions that you have with the other people around your office and around your campus. You have to talk to people. Like, requirement, you have to talk to people. Even if it's hard to do, you can do it via email if it's hard for you to do it in person. But the internal communications element of it really does strengthen the way that people will perceive what you're putting out there. And it's a hard thing to overcome, and it's a hard thing to deal with people because everyone is difficult, but also there's hidden solutions in every single human being that's out there that we haven't necessarily tapped into because we're looking toward the technology first and not the human beings. So, I don't know, just in your fellow humans, that's a good takeaway thought, right?
Human, you know what? Human first strategy. Even more than
I have been advocating for it for a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, really, we're just talking to other people through different means. So,
yeah, absolutely.
I like it. I like it.
Well,
this has been a really, really great conversation. Thanks so much, Maayan, for joining me for this, and everyone who's been watching live. We'll be back soon with new shows. I actually do not, off the top of my mind, know what the topic of the next show is. I apologize, but I'm sure it will be fantastic. And all of you have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember that next time someone comes to you with some shiny new design feature, make sure to softly let them down by asking them what content they're going to provide for it. All right, we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.